Hello everybody, my name is Nubad and welcome to my very first Amon build video. This time around, we're starting strong with my Hellshot Amon build. A build focused on mob clearing and stacking elemental damage on trash mobs and bosses alike to melt through their health. This build makes heavy use of a very involved gameplay loop by spam reloading, amping through stims, and ordnance spamming to synergize with all the skills that we pick up. This skill heavily leverages the force of nature augment to prime enemies in anticipation for their eventual detonation through death, or Stormcutter application, which we'll be spamming a lot of. These detonations deal massive damage to the enemy and those around them, which further fuels this mass mobbing build. This spec heavily uses the Calamity tree to stack bonuses from skills like Dragon's Breath, Catastrophe, and Electrical Fire, as well as branch 1 bonuses like Berserk and There Is Only Red. However, there's an additional skill tree variation I suggest if you want to go all in on bossing and improve your damage to that. While this build is heavily focused on mobbing, this other variation can help with bossing as well, so keep an eye out. I'll be writing up all this on the mobalytics.gg website as well, so I'll have a full detail write-up on every skill and every variation, all the weapons you can choose as well. So if you want further detail on different variations and just have an easier way to look at the skill trees, feel free to check the website out. I'll put the link in the description down below. So, as I said before, there's two variations to this build. To keep this video short, I'm just going to focus on the mobbing variation. However, like I said, I'll also have a link to the bossing variation as well, in addition to the mobbing variation, so have a look in the Mobalytics website for that as well. To kick things off from the skill tree perspective, we start with the Calamity tree, and we start with what burns within. This skill gives Amon increased incendiary damage, fairly self-explanatory. Since we're going to be spamming Dragon's Breath, boosting the damage output of the skill through incendiary damage bonuses is going to pay dividends, so wherever we can boost status effect damage and incendiary damage, we pick. We then pick up Tritanium Knuckles, which gives Amon increased melee damage and skill damage. This once again is another boost to Amon's Dragon Breath skill, as it scales the skill damage as well. The melee damage will also boost Stormcutter, which helps with priming and detonation as well. We also have Wield the Storm, which boosts our status damage, or damage over time ticks, which we're going to be spam inflicting onto the enemy through our elemental weapons. We then pick up Metal Edge, which helps us to cycle our action skill faster, so we can keep up our prime stacking with Force of Nature. For branch 1, we pick Berserk, which is a source of additional elemental damage through adding extra cryo damage, and then we have There Is Only Red, which further boosts the damage output of Berserk by scaling our cryo damage up exponentially. With Berserk, our cryo damage caps out at 30%, with There Is Only Red, we can go all the way up to 600%, which is incredibly powerful. We then move into branch 3, where we have Catastrophe, which is very handy at basically an always active 30% crit damage boost to all our shots. And since we're always going to have enemies inflicted with incendiary damage over time ticks, this is going to be very useful, as because we're burning enemies, we get that crit damage very often. We then have Dragon's Breath. This is the star of the show and is how we apply some huge fire dots to enemies to one-shot them. This skill adds a huge damage boost to our first shot following an ordnance activation, which we're going to be spamming a lot of, and I'll explain how soon. We also pick up Fists of Stone. This helps us to cycle our action skill faster, and once again, spamming Stormcutter and hitting a minimum of 4 enemies with it will immediately give us Onslaughter again to further fuel that gameplay loop. We then have Electrical Fire. Since the base element of the melee 1 shotgun we're using is shock, this is also going to help us apply fire dots to the enemy and vice versa. If you're using weapons like the linebacker shotgun, which is also a fun weapon to use for this build, you can apply shock damages conversely. We then have a few more points to spend, and we move into the Cybernetics tree to pick up Get the Lead Out. Because we're going to be spam reloading to make use of the melee 1 enhancement that I'm going to talk about shortly, boosting our release speed is going to help a lot. Now, as far as augments and capstones go, we start with the augment selection, and that's Force of Nature. What this does is while Onslaughter is active, gun damage dealt to enemies will prime them for a duration and will detonate when they die or are damaged by a force skill, which deals incendiary damage to nearby enemies. Think of this like short fuse from O's kind of, in the sense that it will do damage to enemies nearby as they die. These detonations can also be triggered by melee attack damage, so things like Stormcutter is going to trigger this as well, but it will deal less damage. And this effect can stack, so you can have up to 10 prime stacks on an enemy, which deals a whole bunch of damage when they explode. For the capstone, we pick Stormcutter. This basically that launches a wave in front of us that deals shock melee damage to all enemies it passes through. Now, while the damage from this as it detonates enemies is very useful, it's also a bit of a utility capstone as well, as every enemy we hit refunds action skill cooldown. So, like I was saying before, if you hit a bunch of enemies with this in one swing, we can get our Onslaughter back up and running. Now, for weapon selection, we have a fair bit of choice, but what I highly suggest is starting with a melee 1 shotgun, which has high elemental damage over time, and ideally shock and corrosive. Now, the melee 1 shotgun that I'm using in the gameplay is either a blue or a purple one, depending on the clip, but the point is that either way, they have very high elemental status application chance and also a very high damage over time tick that can apply to enemies. This scales very well with all the skills that we picked up before and discussed earlier, so I strongly recommend this. You can farm this realistically from anywhere, so just find a boss that you can kill very quickly and just loop over and over again until you get a drop. Next up is a weapon that you can farm pretty reliably, and that's the linebacker shotgun. This is a Torg shotgun, does a whole heap of splash damage and amps very well with the amp rep kit and the dragon's breath bonuses as well. We also have the wombo combo. Now this weapon isn't perfectly synergistic with this build, but helps to take down ranged enemies and get the second wins in case you go down for enemies that are a bit further away. As far as the ordinances go, we have the Sho Kunai. Now the reason why we picked this is because it has 7 charges, so you can spam this a lot. And by constantly spamming this, you can proc your Dragon's Breath, which is activated for every time you throw your ordnance out. So by spamming this, we can get our Dragon's Breath amp as much as we can for our weapon shots, so we can make sure that every shot we fire from our Maliwan shotgun is incredibly high damage. Then for bossing, you can swap to any sort of ordnance, heavy weapon ordnance, like a bottle lightning or any purple Torg relevant element that you're using to kill the boss that you're trying to fight, and you just swap that out from the Sho Kunai, kill the boss, move on. For the rep kits, we use a triple bypass with a 200% amp roll specifically. The reason why we use the triple bypass is because every time we kill an enemy, there's a 30% chance to replenish the charge for this, and because this has a 200% amp roll, we're going to be spamming this to amp the damage of our Dragon Breath shots as well. So very useful and very synergistic with this build. For the enhancement, and this is yet another bit of fuel to the fire that is this build, we use a legendary Maliwan enhancement with the Prime Potency effect that gives us 100% status chance for our first shot after reloading, as well as the Transfuser effect, which gives us the ability to spread our status damage to nearby enemies as well. This further fuels the dot spreading capabilities of this build, much like the Plague. So basically, find a cluster of enemies, do your little amp Dragon Breath Maliwan shotgun shot into one of them, and it will spread to all the enemies. They'll all get dotted, they'll all die very quickly. For the shield, we use the all reliable fireworks shield to do some mob clearing for us while we're shooting. This shield rockets are also incredibly powerful and can clear trash mobs on their own completely, or finish off low health ones that our dots didn't finish off. We then have the class mod, and here's where you get a bit of choice. For optimal bossing damage, we use a Furnace Com with as many points as possible into Dragon's Breath, which will boost the per shot damage output of this build by a huge margin. Now, while you can still use the Furnace Com for mobbing with 0 issues, if you find that you're struggling to maintain uptime of Onslaughter, you can swap to a Forge Master class mod to help you spam Stormcutter a bit more, and make sure you can keep Onslaughter active as much as you can. As far as specializations go, you pick 4, right? So we start with I Am a Gun. This gives us a big bonus to detonations from Force of Nature, and increases damage of Stormcutter as well to clear enemies in front of us. We pick up Bare Arms, which makes melee damage now benefit from increases to gun damage, which ultimately ends up boosting our Stormcutter damage, which is very nice. Next, we have Compounding Afflictions. Now, because we're going to be spreading dots to many enemies as possible and spreading that through our Maliwan enhancements, Compounding Afflictions basically increases the amount of damage that they take. So you do this bit of fueling build that becomes a bit of a loop. You proc one enemy, it spreads to another enemy, it spreads to another enemy, so on and so forth. So you get a bit of a loop from that. The final specialization we have is Overkill, and I don't think this needs to be explained too much. Explosions equals good AoE clearing for clustered enemies. Fire one shot, kill many. Now, as far as the gameplay loop for this goes, as I said at the start of this write-up, this build focuses heavily on looping multiple different mechanics to achieve the outcome of mob clearing. Here's a simple step-by-step guide on how this build works. Basically, you shoot your shotgun once and reload to get the bonuses out of your Maliwan enhancement, since it gives a 100% status chance effect on reloading. You then pop your triple bypass rep kit to amp your next shot, you throw your Sho Kunai to proc your Dragon's Breath on your next shot, shoot gun for big damage, enemy vaporizes, and you can loop this over and over again. In the interim, activating your Forge skill will also activate Berserk, and there is only red rolling, so you can start building up your cryo damage and amp up to 600% very, very quickly. And from there, you basically just loop those steps over and over again until quite literally every living thing on Kairos is dead. So that's pretty much the build in a nutshell. Hope you guys found it useful. As I said before, I didn't have enough time and I don't want to make this video too long and explain all the different variations for this, but Mobalytics will have the full written guide as well, so feel free to check that out. If you have any other questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments below and let me know what sort of builds you want to see next. Catch you guys in the next one. See ya.